The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Henderson's training grounds as 23-year-old Sarah Martinez adjusted her military jacket for the third time. The fabric felt heavy against her skin, but not as heavy as the weight of proving herself to Colonel James Harrison, a man whose reputation for being tough on female soldiers preceded him like thunder before lightning. Sarah had joined the Army 2 years ago with dreams of serving her country and making her late father proud. He had been a decorated veteran who always told her that courage wasn't about being fearless, but about doing what's right despite the fear. Now, standing in formation with her fellow soldiers, she wondered if her father could see her struggling to find that courage. Colonel Harrison emerged from the command building, his boots clicking against the concrete with military precision. At 52, he was a mountain of a man with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to cut through pretense like a knife through butter. He had served 3 tours overseas and earned more medals than most soldiers could dream of. His presence alone made recruits straighten their spines and hold their breath. "Listen up, soldiers," his voice boomed across the courtyard. "Today we begin advanced physical training. This isn't your basic boot camp routine anymore. This is what separates the real soldiers from those who just wear the uniform." His gaze swept across the formation, lingering slightly longer on the female soldiers. "Some of you might think you can take shortcuts or make excuses. In my unit, there are no participation trophies." Sarah felt her heart race, but not from anticipation. The colonel's words carried an undertone that made her stomach twist. She had heard the whispers from other female soldiers about Colonel Harrison's attitude. He believed women belonged in support roles, not on the front lines, and he made no effort to hide his opinion. The physical training began with a series of demanding exercises: push-ups, sit-ups, rope climbing, and obstacle courses that pushed every soldier to their limits. Sarah kept pace with her male counterparts, her body burning with exertion but her determination burning brighter. She had trained for months to be ready for this moment. But as the morning progressed, Sarah began to struggle with one particular exercise that required extensive arm movements and upper body flexibility. Each time she attempted the maneuver, sharp pains shot through her shoulders and back, causing her to pause and adjust her jacket. The discomfort was becoming impossible to ignore, and her performance started to suffer. Colonel Harrison noticed immediately. He approached Sarah with the swagger of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Martinez, what seems to be the problem here? Are you finding this too challenging for your delicate constitution?" His voice dripped with sarcasm, loud enough for the other soldiers to hear. "No, sir," Sarah replied, trying to maintain her composure while fighting through another wave of pain. "I just need a moment to adjust my gear." The colonel's eyes narrowed. "Adjust your gear? Soldier, that uniform has been worn by countless men and women before you. If they could manage, surely you can figure it out." He crossed his arms over his chest, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "Unless you're looking for special treatment because you're a woman." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had worked twice as hard as many of her male colleagues just to be taken seriously, and now she was being dismissed as weak, simply because she was struggling with movements that caused her genuine pain. The other soldiers watched in uncomfortable silence, some sympathetic, others simply grateful the colonel's attention wasn't focused on them. "Sir, I'm not seeking special treatment," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. "I have a legitimate medical reason for my difficulty with these particular movements." Colonel Harrison let out a harsh laugh that echoed across the training ground. "A medical reason? Let me guess, you pulled a muscle painting your nails?" Several soldiers shifted uncomfortably at his crude comment, but none dared to speak up. "In my experience, young lady, medical reasons are often code for 'I don't want to do the hard work.'" Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had endured months of subtle discrimination and snide remarks, but this public humiliation was pushing her toward a breaking point. The colonel's assumption that she was weak or looking for excuses felt like a betrayal of everything she had sacrificed to serve her country. "With respect, sir," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "you don't know anything about my medical history or what I've been through to get here." The colonel stepped closer, using his height and presence to intimidate. "Then enlighten me, soldier. What terrible hardship has befallen you that prevents you from doing a simple exercise that every other person here can manage?" The training ground fell silent except for the sound of wind rustling through nearby trees. Sarah looked around at the faces of her fellow soldiers, some encouraging, others skeptical. She thought about her father's words about courage and doing what's right despite fear. She thought about every woman who had served before her and everyone who would come after. In that moment, Sarah made a decision that would change not only her relationship with Colonel Harrison, but potentially her entire military career. She reached for the zipper of her jacket, knowing that what she was about to reveal would either vindicate her completely or end her time in the army forever. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as they found the zipper of her military jacket. The metal felt cold against her fingertips, a stark contrast to the heat building in her chest. She had never shown these scars to anyone in the military, not even during her medical examinations. The doctors who had cleared her for service already knew her history from her medical records. But seeing the physical evidence was entirely different. Colonel Harrison watched with a mixture of impatience and curiosity as Sarah hesitated. "Well, Martinez, are you going to show me this mysterious medical condition? Or are we going to stand here all day while the other soldiers waste valuable training time?" The other soldiers had formed a loose circle around them, though most tried to appear as if they weren't watching. Sergeant Williams, a veteran with kind eyes who had always been supportive of the female soldiers, took a small step forward. He seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen, though he couldn't have imagined what. Sarah took a deep breath and slowly pulled down her zipper. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet morning air. As her jacket opened, she carefully slipped it off her shoulders, revealing the standard-issue military tank top underneath. But it wasn't the regulation clothing that caught everyone's attention. Covering Sarah's shoulders, arms, and what was visible of her back was an intricate network of scars. They weren't the clean, straight lines of surgical scars, but the twisted, irregular patterns that spoke of something far more traumatic. The scars were old, well-healed, but still clearly visible against her skin like a roadmap of pain that she carried with her everywhere. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Colonel Harrison, a man who prided himself on never being surprised, stood with his mouth slightly open, his prepared sarcastic comments dying in his throat. The scars were extensive, covering areas that would make any physical training involving upper body movement genuinely challenging and potentially painful. "Jesus Christ," whispered Private Johnson, one of the newer recruits, before quickly covering his mouth and looking around nervously. Several other soldiers shifted uncomfortably, suddenly understanding that they had been witnessing something much more serious than a lazy soldier making excuses. Sarah stood straighter despite her vulnerability, meeting Colonel Harrison's shocked gaze directly. "These scars are from a house fire when I was 16, sir. I was trapped under a burning beam for 47 minutes before the firefighters could reach me. The doctor said I was lucky to survive, and even luckier to have full use of my arms and shoulders." Her voice was steady, professional, though those who listened carefully could hear the slight tremor of emotion underneath. Colonel Harrison's face had gone pale beneath his usual commanding demeanor. His eyes traced the patterns of the scars, and for the first time since Sarah had known him, he seemed at a loss for words. The arrogance and condescension that had filled his voice moments before had completely vanished. "The skin grafts and muscle repair surgeries have left me with limited flexibility in certain positions," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Certain movements cause significant pain and can reopen old tissue damage. But I passed all my medical examinations because I trained for 2 years to build up my strength and work around these limitations." She gestured to her shoulders and arms, where the scars were most visible. "I don't use this as an excuse to avoid difficult training, sir. I use it as motivation to prove that physical limitations don't define a person's ability to serve their country. My father died in Iraq when I was 14, and these scars didn't stop me from wanting to honor his memory by serving." The impact of her words was immediate and profound. Several soldiers looked down at their feet, ashamed of their earlier assumptions. Sergeant Williams nodded with obvious respect, while others exchanged glances that conveyed their newfound understanding of what true courage looked like. Colonel Harrison remained silent for what felt like an eternity. His usual quick wit and sharp tongue seemed to have abandoned him completely. He looked from Sarah's scars to her face, then back to the scars, as if trying to process not just what he was seeing, but what it meant about his own behavior and assumptions. "Martinez," he finally said, his voice significantly quieter than before. "How long have you been dealing with these injuries?" 7 years, sir," Sarah replied. But I've never let them stop me from doing anything I set my mind to. I just sometimes need to modify my approach to certain activities. The colonel's jaw tightened, but not with anger. It seemed more like he was struggling with some internal battle. And you never mentioned this during training because I wanted to be judged on my performance, not on my medical history, Sarah said firmly. I didn't want anyone's pity or special treatment. I wanted to prove that I belong here just like any other soldier. Colonel Harrison looked around at the assembled soldiers, many of whom were still staring in shock and admiration at Sarah's scars and her courage in revealing them. He seemed to be seeing not just Sarah but all of his soldiers, in a completely different light. "Get your jacket back on, soldier," he said finally, though his tone had changed completely from the mocking command voice he had used earlier. There was something else there now, something that sounded almost like respect, though he clearly wasn't ready to fully acknowledge it yet. Sarah carefully put her jacket back on, wincing slightly as the fabric settled over her shoulders. As she zipped it up, she looked directly at Colonel Harrison, her eyes conveying a message that went beyond words. She had shown her truth. Now it was up to him to decide what kind of leader he wanted to be. The rest of the training session passed in an uncomfortable tension that seemed to hang over the entire group like a heavy fog. Colonel Harrison had dismissed the formation early, claiming he needed to review training protocols, but everyone understood that Sarah's revelation had shaken him more than he was willing to admit publicly. As the soldiers dispersed to their various duties, Sarah found herself walking alone toward the barracks. She felt emotionally drained from exposing such a private part of her life, but also strangely relieved. For 2 years, she had carried the weight of hiding her scars and the story behind them. Now, at least with this group, the secret was out. "Martinez, wait up," called Sergeant Williams, jogging to catch up with her. At 38, Williams was one of the more experienced non-commissioned officers on the base, and Sarah had always appreciated his fair treatment of all soldiers, regardless of gender or background. "That took guts. What you did back there," he said as he fell into step beside her. "I've served with a lot of brave soldiers, but I've rarely seen someone stand up to Harrison like that. Especially not by showing vulnerability instead of aggression." Sarah managed a weak smile. "I'm not sure it was courage, Sergeant. I think I just got tired of being accused of being weak when I know how strong I really am." Williams nodded thoughtfully. "You know, Harrison wasn't always like this. When I first served under him 8 years ago, he was tough but fair. He pushed everyone equally hard, men and women alike." He paused, seeming to consider whether to continue. "Something changed after his daughter died in Afghanistan." Sarah stopped walking, turning to face the sergeant with surprise. "His daughter?" "Captain Jennifer Harrison. She was killed by an IED 3 years ago while leading a convoy mission." William's voice grew quiet with respect for the dead. She was everything he wanted in a soldier. Tough, smart, dedicated. After she died, something broke in him. It's like he decided that if he could prove women didn't belong in combat roles, somehow her death would make more sense. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had assumed Colonel Harrison's attitude toward female soldiers was simply old-fashioned prejudice, but learning about his daughter's death added layers of pain and grief that she hadn't considered. Suddenly, his harsh treatment felt less like malice and more like a father's desperate attempt to protect other daughters from the same fate. "Does he know that I know?" Sarah asked about Jennifer. "No, he doesn't talk about her to anyone. I only know because I served with her before she died. She was a lot like you, actually. Determined to prove herself, never backed down from a challenge, always put the mission first." Williams studied Sarah's face carefully. "Maybe that's why your situation hit him so hard today." Over the next few days, an odd dynamic developed between Sarah and Colonel Harrison. He no longer singled her out for criticism, but he also didn't acknowledge what had happened during the training session. Instead, he watched her carefully during exercises, and Sarah began to notice small changes in how he structured the training routines. Certain exercises were modified to have alternative approaches, which benefited not just Sarah but several other soldiers who had their own physical limitations. The colonel never explicitly stated these changes were because of Sarah's revelation, but the timing was too coincidental to ignore. Meanwhile, word of what had happened began to spread throughout the base, though Sarah noticed that the story grew more dramatic with each telling. Some versions had her showing battle scars from combat. Others claimed she had been tortured as a prisoner of war. She did her best to correct the misinformation when she encountered it, But rumors had a life of their own in military communities. The real test came during a particularly challenging obstacle course exercise designed to simulate combat conditions. Sarah approached the section that had given her trouble before, the one that required extensive upper body flexibility and could aggravate her scar tissue. She had been dreading this moment, knowing that all eyes would be on her performance. As she prepared to attempt the obstacle, Colonel Harrison appeared beside her. "Martinez," he said quietly, so only she could hear, "I've been thinking about what you showed us the other day." Sarah braced herself for another confrontation, but his tone was different than before. There was no mockery or condescension, just a weariness that made him seem older than his 52 years. "I want you to know that I've been in contact with the medical staff," he continued. "They've confirmed your condition and the limitations it places on certain movements. They've also confirmed that you've been pushing through significant pain to maintain your performance levels." Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. This was the closest thing to an acknowledgement she had received from him since the incident. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want an honest answer," Colonel Harrison said, his eyes fixed on the obstacle course ahead of them. "When you're out there pushing through that pain, what drives you? What makes it worth it?" Sarah considered the question carefully. She could have given him the standard military answer about duty and honor, but something in his voice suggested he needed a more personal truth. "My father used to tell me that courage isn't about not feeling afraid or not feeling pain," she said finally. "It's about feeling those things and choosing to do what's right anyway. When I'm hurting out there, I think about him, and about proving to myself that his daughter didn't give up just because things got difficult." Colonel Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as if he was struggling with emotions he didn't want to show. "Your father sounds like he was a good man," he said eventually. "He was, sir. He would have been proud to see me serving, scars and all." Something shifted in the colonel's expression, a crack in the armor he had built around his grief. "I think you're right about that, soldier. I think he would be very proud indeed." 2 weeks after Sarah's revelation, the atmosphere on the base had begun to shift in ways both subtle and profound. The colonel's training methods had evolved to become more inclusive without sacrificing their intensity, and other soldiers had begun to open up about their own challenges and limitations. What had started as one woman's desperate attempt to prove herself had somehow become a catalyst for broader change. Sarah was reviewing tactical manuals in the base library when she noticed Colonel Harrison enter, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. He browsed the shelves for several minutes before approaching her table, a thick folder tucked under his arm. "Martinez, do you have a few minutes?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual commanding authority. "Of course, sir," Sarah replied, closing her manual and giving him her full attention. The colonel sat down across from her, placing the folder on the table between them. "I want to share something with you, and I need you to understand that this conversation stays between us unless I say otherwise." Sarah nodded, sensing the gravity of whatever was about to be revealed. Colonel Harrison opened the folder, revealing a collection of photographs, military documents, and newspaper clippings. The top photograph showed a young woman in military dress uniform, her smile bright and confident. Sarah could see the family resemblance immediately, the same determined eyes, the same strong jawline. "This is my daughter, Jennifer," the colonel said, his voice softer than Sarah had ever heard it. "Captain Jennifer Harrison, killed in action 3 years ago in Afghanistan." Sarah looked at the photo, seeing not just the colonel's daughter, but a fellow female soldier who had faced many of the same challenges Sarah now encountered. "She's beautiful, sir. She looks like she was a strong person. She was stubborn as hell," Colonel Harrison said with a mixture of pride and pain. "Just like her old man, according to her mother. Jennifer was determined to serve in combat roles from the day she enlisted. Nothing I said could change her mind." He pulled out another document, Jennifer's service record. She graduated top of her class from West Point, completed Ranger training, and deployed twice before. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Sarah studied the records, impressed by the young woman's achievements. "She was clearly an exceptional soldier, sir. She was everything I thought a soldier should be," Colonel Harrison agreed. "Tough, dedicated, never complained about the hardships. When she died, I convinced myself it was because I had failed to protect her. I thought if I could just make military service difficult enough for women, Maybe fewer fathers would have to go through what I went through. The admission hung in the air between them like a confession. Sarah began to understand the depth of pain that had driven the colonel's harsh treatment of female soldiers. But watching you these past few weeks has made me realize something. He continued. Jennifer didn't die because she was weak or unprepared. She died because war is dangerous, and good people sometimes pay the ultimate price for serving their country. That's true whether you're male or female. Sarah felt a lump forming in her throat. Sir, I can't imagine the pain of losing a child. But I think your daughter would want you to honor her memory by supporting other women who choose to serve, not by trying to drive them away. Colonel Harrison's eyes filled with unshed tears, though his military bearing remained intact. The night before Jennifer's final deployment, she called me. We argued about her decision to extend her tour. I told her she had nothing left to prove, that she should come home and maybe consider a safer assignment. He paused, struggling with the memory. Her last words to me were that she wasn't serving to prove anything to anyone. She was serving because it was right, and she could make a difference. She sounds like an incredible person, Sarah said gently. When I saw your scars and heard your story, it hit me like a punch to the gut, the colonel admitted. Here you were, carrying pain and limitations that most people couldn't imagine, and you weren't asking for special treatment or looking for an easy way out. You were fighting to serve despite your challenges, just like Jennifer fought to serve despite my objections. Colonel Harrison reached into the folder and pulled out a letter, yellowed with age and worn from handling. This is the last letter Jennifer wrote to me. She never got to send it. It was found among her personal effects after she died. He handed the letter to Sarah with shaking hands. Would you read it? I think you'll understand why I need to hear it from someone other than myself. Sarah took the letter carefully, recognizing the weight of trust the colonel was placing in her. The handwriting was neat and purposeful, clearly belonging to someone accustomed to writing military reports. Dear Dad, Sarah read aloud, her voice gentle but clear. I know you worry about me being here, and I know you think I'm trying to prove something because I'm a woman. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I believe in something bigger than myself, and because I have skills that can help keep other people safe. You taught me that service means sacrifice, and sometimes that sacrifice is dangerous regardless of who you are. Sarah paused, glancing at the colonel, whose composure was clearly being tested. I hope someday you understand that my choice to serve isn't about rebellion or proving women belong in combat, she continued reading. It's about the same thing that drove you to serve. Love of country and the belief that freedom is worth protecting. I hope when my service is over, whether that's in 6 months or 30 years, you'll be proud not because I proved women can do this job, but because I did this job well. Your loving daughter, Jenny. The library fell silent except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Colonel Harrison sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly as he finally allowed himself to grieve not just for his daughter, but for the way grief had twisted his judgment. She was right, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was just trying to serve with honor, and I've been dishonoring her memory by treating soldiers like you the way I have. Sarah carefully folded the letter and handed it back to him. Sir, it's never too late to honor her memory the right way. Jennifer would want you to support soldiers who are committed to serving well, regardless of their gender or their challenges. Colonel Harrison looked up at her, his eyes red but clearer than they had been in years. Martinez, I owe you an apology. Not just for how I treated you, but for what I've put other female soldiers through because I was too broken to see past my own pain. Sir, with respect, you don't owe me an apology, Sarah replied. You owe it to every soldier you lead, male and female, to be the kind of leader your daughter would have been proud to serve under. The transformation in Colonel Harrison didn't happen overnight, but it was undeniable. Over the following weeks, Sarah watched as he began to dismantle the barriers he had built between himself and his soldiers, particularly the female ones. It started with small changes, addressing soldiers by their names instead of dismissive nicknames, listening to concerns without immediately dismissing them, and acknowledging good performance regardless of who demonstrated it. The most significant change came during a particularly grueling training exercise designed to test soldiers' ability to work as a team under pressure. The scenario involved rescuing wounded teammates while under simulated enemy fire, requiring not just individual strength but coordination and trust between team members. Sarah found herself paired with Private Rodriguez, a newer recruit who was struggling with confidence issues. Rodriguez was technically skilled, but had been shaken by some of Colonel Harrison's earlier harsh criticism. As they approached their assigned obstacle, Sarah could see the nervousness in his movements. "Hey, Rodriguez," Sarah said quietly as they prepared for their turn. "Remember, this isn't about proving you're strong enough. It's about proving we work well together." The exercise began with a simulated explosion, and Sarah and Rodriguez had to navigate through smoke and debris to reach their wounded teammate, played by another soldier. The challenge required Sarah to use the exact upper body movements that caused her the most pain, but she pushed through, focusing on the mission rather than her discomfort. Halfway through the course, Rodriguez stumbled and fell, twisting his ankle in the process. The injury wasn't severe, but it was painful enough to slow him down significantly. Sarah could have easily completed the exercise alone and left Rodriguez behind. It would have been the faster option, and no one would have blamed her. Instead, she helped Rodriguez to his feet and adjusted their approach. "We finish this together or not at all," she told him firmly. "That's what teammates do." Colonel Harrison watched from the observation platform as Sarah and Rodriguez modified their technique to accommodate his injury. It took them longer than the other teams, and Sarah was clearly struggling with pain from her old injuries. But they refused to give up on each other. When they finally crossed the finish line, both soldiers were exhausted and hurting, but they had successfully completed the mission. The colonel approached them as they caught their breath, his expression unreadable. "Rodriguez, how's that ankle?" he asked, his tone showing genuine concern rather than irritation. "It's sore, sir, but I'll be fine," Rodriguez replied, still breathing heavily. "Get it looked at by medical," Colonel Harrison ordered. "And Rodriguez, good job adapting when the situation changed. That's real soldiering." He turned to Sarah, who was trying to hide the fact that her shoulders were screaming with pain from the exercise. "Martinez, walk with me." As they moved away from the other soldiers, Colonel Harrison's demeanor became more personal. "You could have finished that course in half the time if you'd left Rodriguez behind." "Yes, sir, probably," Sarah agreed. "But that wouldn't have been the right thing to do. Even though helping him meant more pain for you? I saw you struggling with those overhead movements." Sarah stopped walking and faced him directly. "Sir, pain is temporary, but how we treat our teammates, how we handle adversity, that defines who we are as soldiers and as people." Rodriguez needed to know that someone believed in him enough not to give up on him. Colonel Harrison studied her face, seeing something that reminded him powerfully of his daughter's unwavering commitment to doing what was right regardless of personal cost. "You know, Jennifer once told me something similar," he said. "She was leading a patrol that came under fire, and one of her soldiers froze up. Instead of moving past him to safety, she stayed with him until he could function again. They both made it out, but she put herself at extra risk for a soldier who might have gotten them both killed." "What did you tell her when you heard about it?" Sarah asked. "I was furious," the colonel admitted. "I told her she had endangered the whole mission by babying a weak soldier. She looked at me with those determined eyes of hers and said, 'Dad, a leader who leaves people behind isn't really leading anyone.'" The weight of that memory settled between them. Sarah could see the colonel processing the parallel between his daughter's philosophy and the choice she had just made with Rodriguez. "I didn't understand what she meant then," he continued. "I thought leadership was about making the hard choices, even if it meant sacrificing the weak for the strong. But watching you today, seeing how Rodriguez responded to your support instead of my criticism, I'm beginning to understand that maybe Jennifer was the better leader between the two of us." That evening, Colonel Harrison called an unusual meeting with all the soldiers in his command. The assembled group wondered what had prompted the gathering, especially given the colonel's recent changes in behavior. "I want to address something that's been weighing on my mind," he began, his voice carrying a gravity that immediately captured everyone's attention. "For the past 3 years I've been leading this unit from a place of anger and grief, rather than wisdom and strength." The soldiers exchanged glances, unsure where this confession was heading. "I lost my daughter in combat 3 years ago," he continued, his voice steady despite the emotional content. "Captain Jennifer Harrison was everything I thought a soldier should be, and when she died, I convinced myself that the best way to honor her memory was to make military service so difficult for women that fewer of them would choose combat roles." Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized the colonel was publicly acknowledging not just his loss, but his mistakes. What I've learned recently is that I was dishonoring Jennifer's memory and failing all of you as a leader, Colonel Harrison said. Good soldiers aren't defined by their gender, their physical limitations, or their willingness to accept abuse from their commanding officers. Good soldiers are defined by their commitment to the mission, their loyalty to their teammates, and their willingness to do what's right even when it's difficult. He looked directly at Sarah as he continued. Some of you have shown me what real courage looks like, even when I was too blind to recognize it. You've taught me that strength isn't about hiding your vulnerabilities. It's about overcoming them while still caring for others. The room was completely silent, every soldier hanging on his words. From now on, this unit will operate on the principles my daughter believed in, and that some of you have demonstrated despite my failures, Colonel Harrison declared. We will be tough on standards but fair in our treatment. We will push each other to excel while supporting those who struggle, and we will remember that we're stronger together than any of us could be alone. 6 months had passed since Sarah's revelation, and the changes in Colonel Harrison's unit had become the talk of the entire base. Other commanding officers were taking notice of the improved morale, better performance scores, and significantly reduced disciplinary issues among his soldiers. What had started as one woman's desperate stand against prejudice had evolved into a model of inclusive leadership that was attracting attention from higher command. Sarah had been promoted to corporal and was now helping to train new recruits, many of whom specifically requested assignment to Colonel Harrison's unit after hearing about the supportive environment. She found herself in the unique position of being both a symbol of perseverance and a bridge between the colonel's old methods and his new philosophy. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah was leading a group of new female recruits through basic combat techniques when she noticed a familiar figure watching from the observation deck. Colonel Harrison had taken to observing training sessions more frequently, but not to find fault. Instead, he watched to learn and to ensure his new leadership approach was being properly implemented throughout all levels of command. After the session, he approached Sarah with a document in his hand and an expression that mixed pride with something that looked almost like nervousness. Corporal Martinez, I need to speak with you privately, he said, gesturing toward his office. Once inside, Colonel Harrison closed the door and took a seat across from Sarah, rather than behind his imposing desk. Another change in his approach that hadn't gone unnoticed by his subordinates. I've received some interesting communications from headquarters, he began, sliding the document across to her. It seems word of our unit's transformation has reached some very high places. Sarah picked up the document and began reading. Her eyes widened as she realized it was an invitation to speak at a military leadership conference, specifically about overcoming physical limitations and creating inclusive military environments. Sir, I'm not sure I'm qualified to speak at something like this, Sarah said, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the opportunity. Martinez, you're more qualified than anyone I know, Colonel Harrison replied firmly. You've lived these challenges and found ways to overcome them, while still serving with distinction. More importantly, you've shown that addressing individual limitations can actually strengthen the entire unit. He leaned forward, his expression serious but supportive. I want you to know that I've recommended you for this speaking engagement. And I've also submitted paperwork for your consideration for officer candidate school, if that's something you're interested in pursuing. Sarah felt her breath catch. Officer candidate school had been a dream she'd harbored, but never thought achievable given her medical history and the challenges she'd faced with leadership acceptance. Sir, are you sure about this recommendation? I mean, considering my limitations, your limitations? Colonel Harrison interrupted, a slight smile playing at his lips. Martinez, your so-called limitations have taught this entire unit lessons about perseverance, teamwork, and true leadership that I couldn't have provided in 20 years of traditional training. Those aren't limitations, they're qualifications. Over the following weeks, Sarah began preparing for the leadership conference while continuing her duties. She spent hours researching and organizing her thoughts about how physical challenges could be transformed into strengths when approached with the right mindset and support systems. The most challenging part of her preparation wasn't organizing her presentation. It was deciding how much of her personal story to share. She knew her scars had been the catalyst for change in her unit, but the idea of exposing that vulnerability to a room full of senior military leaders from different branches was daunting. Colonel Harrison, sensing her struggle, invited her to his home for dinner to discuss her concerns. It was the first time Sarah had seen him outside his military environment, and she was struck by how different he seemed surrounded by family photos and personal mementos. The walls were covered with pictures spanning his entire career, but the most prominent display was dedicated to his daughter Jennifer. Photos showed her progression from a young cadet to a confident officer, always with that same determined smile Sarah had seen in the first photograph. "She would have liked you," Colonel Harrison said, noticing Sarah's attention to the photos. Jennifer always respected people who stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult. During dinner, he shared more stories about his daughter, not just her military achievements, but her sense of humor, her stubbornness, and her unwavering belief that everyone deserved to be treated with respect, regardless of their background or challenges. "You know, after Jennifer died, I thought the best way to honor her was to make sure no other daughters ended up in harm's way," he said as they sat in his living room after the meal. "But you showed me that the real way to honor her is to ensure that everyone who chooses to serve gets the same opportunities she had, to be judged on their merit, supported in their challenges, and respected for their commitment. Sir, I think Jennifer would be proud of the leader you've become," Sarah said quietly. "Change isn't easy, especially when it means admitting mistakes." "Speaking of change," Colonel Harrison said, reaching for another folder on his coffee table, "I have something else to show you. I've been working on a new training protocol that incorporates lessons learned from our experience. Over the past few months, the protocol detailed a comprehensive approach to inclusive leadership that acknowledged individual differences while maintaining high standards. It included sections on identifying hidden strengths, adapting training methods, and creating environments where all soldiers could excel. I want to present this alongside your speech at the conference, he explained. Together we can show other leaders that inclusive practices don't weaken military units. They strengthen them. Sarah looked through the protocol, impressed by its thoroughness and touched by how many of the principles seemed to stem directly from their shared experience. There's one more thing, Colonel Harrison said, his tone becoming more formal. I've been asked to take command of a new training facility that will focus on developing these inclusive leadership principles for implementation across multiple branches of the military. Sarah felt a mixture of pride and sadness. The colonel's promotion was well-deserved, but it would mean the end of their unique working relationship. Congratulations, sir. That sounds like an incredible opportunity. It is, he agreed, and I want you to be part of it. The position comes with the authority to choose my key personnel, and I can't think of anyone better suited to help develop and implement these new training standards. The offer was beyond anything Sarah had imagined when she first zipped up her jacket and revealed her scars 6 months earlier. From a struggling soldier fighting for acceptance to a potential developer of military training standards, the transformation seemed almost impossible to believe. Think about it, Colonel Harrison said, but know that regardless of what you decide, you've already changed more lives than you realize. Starting with mine. The day of the military leadership conference arrived with a crispness that seemed to match the clarity Sarah had found in her purpose. Standing behind the podium at the Pentagon's prestigious Marshall Auditorium, she looked out at an audience filled with colonels, generals, and senior officials from all branches of the military. 6 months ago, she had been a struggling corporal desperate to prove herself worthy of service. Today, she was addressing some of the most powerful leaders in the American military. Colonel Harrison sat in the front row, his presence both supportive and grounding. Next to him sat General Patricia Williams, the 3-star general, who had specifically requested Sarah's presentation after reading reports about the transformation of Harrison's unit. When I enlisted 2 years ago, I thought strength meant hiding my weaknesses, Sarah began, her voice clear and confident. I thought leadership meant never showing vulnerability, and I believed that earning respect required being perfect in every way that others expected me to be. She clicked to her first slide, which showed a simple quote. Courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. My father, Sergeant First Class Miguel Martinez, told me those words when I was 16 years old, lying in a hospital bed with burns covering 40% of my body. At the time, I thought he was talking about physical courage, the ability to face danger despite being afraid. I didn't understand that he was actually teaching me about moral courage, the strength to do what's right even when it's difficult or personally costly. Sarah had decided to share her complete story, scars and all, as she spoke about the house fire, her recovery, and her determination to serve despite her physical limitations. She watched the faces in the audience shift from polite attention to genuine engagement. For the first 18 months of my service, I hid my scars and the limitations they caused, she continued. I pushed through pain, modified my performance to work around my restrictions, and endured criticism from leaders who assumed I was weak or looking for special treatment. She clicked to a slide showing statistics about soldiers who serve with various physical limitations, many of which go unrecognized or unacknowledged. What I learned is that I wasn't unique. Military studies show that nearly 30% of active duty personnel have some form of physical limitation that affects their performance in specific areas. These range from old sports injuries to combat wounds to genetic conditions. Most of these soldiers, like me, hide their challenges because they fear being seen as unfit for service. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. 6 months ago, during a training exercise, I reached my breaking point. My commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, publicly accused me of seeking special treatment when I struggled with exercises that aggravated my scar tissue. In that moment, I had to make a choice: continue hiding my truth or risk my career by revealing it. Sarah clicked to a slide showing a photo of her unit from 6 months earlier, and then another showing the same unit today. The difference in body language and group cohesion was striking. I chose to remove my jacket and show my scars to my entire unit, she said, her voice strong despite the emotional weight of the memory. I expected to be dismissed from service or transferred to a desk job. Instead, something extraordinary happened. She began detailing the transformation that had occurred in their unit. Improved performance scores, higher morale ratings, decreased disciplinary issues, and increased retention rates. Most importantly, she discussed how addressing individual limitations had actually strengthened the overall effectiveness of the team. When leaders create environments where soldiers feel safe to acknowledge their challenges, those soldiers find ways to overcome them while contributing their unique strengths to the mission, Sarah explained. When we stopped pretending that everyone had identical capabilities and started leveraging diverse strengths, we became more effective as a unit. Colonel Harrison watched with obvious pride as Sarah presented the data they had compiled together, showing how inclusive leadership practices had improved every measurable aspect of unit performance. The most important lesson I learned from this experience came from Colonel Harrison himself. Sarah continued, looking directly at him. True leadership isn't about eliminating weaknesses. It's about transforming them into strengths while building an environment where everyone can contribute their best. She clicked to her final slide, which showed another quote: "We are stronger together than any of us could be alone." This principle applies not just to individual soldiers with physical limitations, but to the entire concept of military diversity. When we embrace different backgrounds, perspectives, and capabilities, we don't weaken our military, we strengthen it. The presentation concluded with a detailed overview of the inclusive leadership protocol that Colonel Harrison had developed, including specific implementation strategies that other units could adopt. The applause was immediate and sustained. General Williams was the first to stand, followed quickly by the rest of the audience. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the response, but more than that, she felt a sense of completion, as if the journey that had begun with her father's words in a hospital room had reached a meaningful destination. During the question and answer session that followed, Sarah fielded inquiries from officers eager to implement similar changes in their own commands. The enthusiasm was infectious, and Sarah found herself energized by the possibility that her experience could help other soldiers who were struggling with similar challenges. After the formal presentation, General Williams approached Sarah and Colonel Harrison. "That was remarkable," she said. "I want both of you to know that we're fast-tracking the approval process for implementing these protocols across multiple training facilities." She turned specifically to Sarah. "Corporal Martinez, I understand you're considering officer candidate school. After what I've seen today, I can guarantee you'll have full support from the highest levels of command." Later that evening, at a reception honoring the conference speakers, Sarah found a quiet moment with Colonel Harrison on a balcony overlooking the Potomac River. 6 months ago, I never could have imagined this, she said, gesturing to the reception inside where officers were still discussing implementation strategies. 6 months ago, I was a bitter old soldier who thought strength meant never showing weakness, Colonel Harrison replied. You taught me that real strength comes from acknowledging our vulnerabilities and finding ways to overcome them together. He pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a message he had received that afternoon. It was from Rodriguez, the soldier Sarah had helped during the training exercise months earlier. He had just graduated at the top of his advanced training class and credited his success to learning that asking for help was a sign of strength, not weakness. That's your legacy, Colonel Harrison said. Not just the policy changes or the speaking engagements, but the individual lives you've touched by showing them what courage really looks like. As they stood together watching the sun set over the nation's capital, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The scars on her shoulders and back would always be with her, reminders of pain and trauma that could have defined her limitations. Instead, they had become symbols of resilience, catalyst for change, and proof that strength comes not from perfection, but from the courage to be authentic in the face of adversity. The girl who had once hidden her wounds behind a military jacket had become a leader who helped others find strength in their own vulnerabilities. And in doing so, she had honored not only her father's memory but also the memory of Jennifer Harrison and countless other soldiers who had served with courage. Despite their challenges, the colonel had indeed scoffed at her reasons for struggling with physical training. But when she revealed her scars, she had revealed something far more powerful. The truth that real leadership begins with the courage to show others that being human doesn't make us weak. It makes us strong enough to lift each other up.